So let's discuss that and much more with our roundtable. AP Washington Bureau Chief Julie Pace, Michelle Martin, host of NPR's All Things Considered, ABC News political director Rick Klein, and Susan Glasser, staff writer at The New Yorker. Welcome to all of you this morning, and good morning. Julie, I want to start with you. Let's pick up on the last point of that piece, federal voting legislation. You heard part of President Biden's speech in Philadelphia, a very impassioned speech to defend voting rights, but there's not much of a chance this is going to get through, is it?
Not at the moment. I mean, rhetorically, Biden is saying all of the right things that Democrats want to hear, Democrats in Washington and in the states. But when you look at the actual action that is happening, both from the White House and on Capitol Hill, it's really hard to see certainly how that big piece of legislation that Democrats rallied behind, H.R. 1, how that goes anywhere. So now they have focused their attention much more on legislation that would reinstate parts of the Voting Rights Act. But even that is going to be a really difficult lift. They're writing this legislation in hopes that it could withstand court challenges, but it's really unclear if it would ever actually get passed and even land in that kind of court challenge.
And Michelle, the one word you didn't hear President Biden say in that powerful speech, filibuster.
And it's true, and this was a big disappointment to advocates, obviously, because, you know, Democrats have a structural problem. I mean, the structural problem is you've got the 50-50 Senate, and you've got two Democrats, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, who have said that they are uninterested in changing the rules around that make it easier for Republicans to block legislation, even though they say that they agree with the underlying policy initiatives. But the structural problem that the Democrats have goes way deeper than the Senate. I mean, they have a structural problem in the states. There are 37 legislative chambers that are controlled by Democrats, but 61 are controlled by Republicans. And that's even more than after the last election. And then you've got 23 states where Republicans have what's called a trifecta, where they have all 3 state offices. Democrats have only 15. So they're fighting this long-term battle to where, you know, look, it's been a long-term campaign for Republicans to control the apparatus of state government, which is where these decisions are made, as well as to control. And so that's why the rules matter so much. It really is an uphill battle, which is why you see, you know, the Texas Democrats, for example, you know, doing this kind of swashbuckling move of leaving the state and holding up in Washington. And a lot of analysts are saying that it's all about the headlines. But the reality is that's all they have at this point, is to create public pressure.
And even with that public pressure, Susan, Texas, they don't have much of a chance of this ever working, right? Governor Abbott will just say more special sessions, more special sessions.
Well, that's right. Again, math is math, whether it's in the U.S. Senate or it's in the Texas legislature. And in Texas, they have the votes. And in Washington, D.C. right now, given the way the Democratic majority is a 50-50 majority with one vice president, the math is also on Republican side. And I think, you know, the Texas thing is an example of the theater surrounding this issue because we're gridlocked. Frankly, President Biden's speech is another example, a very impassioned speech, as you said. But when you tell people that this is the biggest crisis since the Civil War, first of all, that is historically disputable. I mean, we've had some terrible crises since the Civil War, including segregation and the Civil Rights Movement, including McCarthyism. But so you tell people that it's this terrible crisis, and yet you don't propose to go to the place that many people believe you need to go, which is to go head on against the filibuster. And you're almost ensuring dashed expectations and more frustration.
It really, Rick, does feel like that passing voting rights, that Democrats have just moved on from that. But they've got a pretty full plate on the Hill right now with these multi-zillion-dollar bills that are on the table there.
They know how to count votes at the White House, and they know that this is not going to move. The voting rights stuff is just stalled. You're not going to get that 50th vote. You're not going to get the rule changes. They don't even have unanimous Democratic support for H.R. 1. So, yes, the big push, despite all of the noise we heard last week over voting rights, is back on infrastructure. And, Martha, it is a make-or-break week. You've got deadlines now for both the partisan and the bipartisan packages, the small package and the big package. Both of them are in the trillions of dollars. And what's so interesting here is I think a lot of us have been covering these packages as if they were an either or. Are you going to go with just Democrats, or are you going to try for something bipartisanship? Now it could be both or neither. It's really a big gamble for the Biden White House, because it's not just even infrastructure, soft infrastructure. This is most of the Biden agenda. agenda that's on the line right here between these two packages. And if they pass, they're big achievements, historic, maybe changing the relationship of government and its citizens. And if they fail, Biden is going to be in a significantly weakened position.
Exactly that. And Julie, just take more on that. With Chuck Schumer ratcheting up the pressure in the Senate, wants a vote on Wednesday for all of this. Is that really a good idea?
I think Schumer feels like they can't let this start to stall out as well, exactly to Rick's point, because so much of the Biden agenda and so much of the Democratic agenda is on the line. They know that this is probably the last big piece of legislation that they're going to be able to do, maybe even before next year's midterms. And so they want to be able to go to voters next year and say, with Democrats in charge, this is what you got. You got COVID relief. You got traditional infrastructure spending. You got what they call human infrastructure spending, more money for childcare, and so more money for climate change programs. This is the agenda on the line, and he feels like every week that passes without some step forward here, even if the actual text of the legislation isn't completed yet, that moves them closer to their end goal. But there are risks, pitfalls all along the way for Democrats here.
Can I just say, though, that this is also a theory of the case. I mean, the Biden theory of the case is not just about a bill. It's about what is government for. Is it to fight these culture war issues? Is it to fight about whether you should outlaw the teaching of some newspaper article in third grade, which isn't ever actually going to get taught? Or is it about government does certain things, and that's what government is for, and, lower the noise and get the job done? And the theory of the case is that if you can actually accomplish that, you can change, like Rick was saying, people's relationship and understanding and trust of what their government is for. So, it actually is a kind of a cultural moment as well as a political moment. And that is in part why there's so much at stake, even if, Biden isn't one to say things in those terms.
And Julie, I want to turn to you on, or Susan, I'm sorry, on DACA. We also saw this week a federal judge in Texas basically doing away with the Obama-era so-called Dreamers Act. What do they do now in terms of legislation?
Well, I do think this increases the urgency of, essentially this is an unaddressed crisis that's been building over now 3 straight presidential administrations. Let's remember that this was a huge problem in the Obama presidency. Obviously, Donald Trump, made demagoguing on the immigration issue a key part of his political appeal from day one and remained unresolved. They held these young dreamers, as they're known, hostage, essentially, to deals that never came in Congress, despite there allegedly being bipartisan support for doing something for these people. It's a classic example, in fact, when you say people are alienated from the government and can the government work, this is a great example of that, because allegedly this is something on which a wide swath of Americans agreed. They've done nothing again and again in search of an elusive bigger deal. So I do think it increases the pressure once again. And of course, there's also these enormous numbers of migrants who've been coming to the southern border. I believe the numbers that were just reported for June were the largest monthly numbers, ever or in recent times. This is a huge pressure point. And yet, because the Biden focus is on the infrastructure bill, it's on the voting rights, especially as, activists worry that the structure of our system is being broken down. You haven't heard as much about immigration, and yet arguably this could be one of the biggest political problems for the Biden administration.
And Rick, I would bet that we are going to start hearing a lot more about the border again, because as Susan pointed out, when you look at those numbers, they are once again alarming. I mean, I know we were down at the border a couple of months ago, right. Lots of attention on it now. It's going to come back.
Well, in some form or fashion, and now it has to, and this DACA ruling forces it, and the Biden administration would like to see this as part of the budget deal that's getting done now, just in case it wasn't big enough. You add something else to the agenda. And Susan's right. Congress could presumably do this tomorrow. You can put a vote on the House floor, the vote on the Senate floor. It would pass based on the people that have sponsored it. But where it gets complicated is when you start talking about other aspects of immigration and this elusive, this white whale that's been chased in Washington for 2 decades now of comprehensive immigration reform. It gets harder because of Donald Trump and because of the way that he changed the politics around it, and also the realities right now on the border. The migrant situation, which has not been handled, I think, from most of the advocates' point of view, adequately or quickly enough by the Biden administration. Once you start adding these other complicating factors, then it becomes just an intractable problem all over again. So it'll be interesting to see if DACA gets done on its own, because it could be done on its own.
And Julie, I want to look back at the Trump administration, because a couple of amazing stories this week. We're going to talk to Susan in a second. But a new book by Washington Post reporters claims that Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, compared Trump's post-election rhetoric to Adolf Hitler's, at one point telling aides, "This is a Reichstag moment." That is a remarkable comment coming from America's highest-ranking military official.
It's shocking and also unsurprising at the same time. It's one of those situations I think we're going to find ourselves in for a while now, where as we look back at the Trump era, you find that what you feared in a lot of these moments was actually happening behind the scenes. And I think it's notable with Milley. You know, Milley is not a political figure. He's not running to run for the Senate.
And we also remember that General Milley walked across Lafayette Square, but peeled off at the last minute for the photo op, and then apologized.
And apologized for that, but was also someone who was in the room with President Trump for a lot of high-level decisions on foreign policy, on military action. He had a relationship with the White House where he could advise this president, and in that moment, that was his assessment. It really, I think, shows just how close we were in those final days of the Trump presidency to really kind of tipping over the line.
And close in those final days to something else, Susan. I know you are working on a book. You had an incredible article in The Atlantic just come out about President Trump wanting to launch an attack on Iran and General Milley doing what?
Well, that's right. I think the two concerns that were playing out over the final months of the Trump presidency from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, both intertwined but also alarming. One was the fear that the president would try to politicize the military and use them to stop the peaceful transfer of power on his own behalf. And that obviously was something that after that June 1st infamous Lafayette Square photo op, I think became very real for the chairman. The other concern that he had, and that played out much more subterraneanly, but in reporting on this book that I'm working on for next year with my husband, Peter Baker, we found that the worry about Iran and Trump and the circle of hawkish advisors around him, that this came up again and again, both before the election and after the election, you know, in a really alarming sense, that it was never something that Trump could let go of. And in fact, actually, General Milley, was saying to the president, if you do what you want to have a strike, that Trump wasn't advocating for a full-blown war, but he kept wanting to have some kind of dramatic strike. And Milley kept saying, if you do this, the consequences are that you're going to have a bleeping war. And, this was something that really continued all the way up until January 3rd of this year, the very final time that the president even spoke with his chairman of the Joint Chiefs. It was only then that he could finally get some of the Iran hawks like Mike Pompeo and Robert O'Brien, the national security advisor, to say, we've run out of time. We can't do this this far into a lame duck presidency.
And Rick, this comes, of course, the timing. You have the committee investigating the January 6th riots about 10 days away. They'll have their first public hearing. Mm-hmm. What are you expecting? And what does Kevin McCarthy do about putting members on that committee?
Yeah, that's the biggest variable. He's got 5 choices. My understanding in talking to people that he's likely to fill those choices. And he's looking at people who are kind of veterans of the Trump congressional wars from his presidency, people like Jim Jordan, people like Devin Nunes. He's talking to some members of the Republican Study Committee, the ultra-conservative wing. He's not going to name Marjorie Taylor Greene, I don't think, even though she put her name forward as a possibility. I think that would make it a little bit of a circus. But look, it's a critical question for McCarthy because he might be a witness on that panel. And it's critical for all the reasons that we're seeing in Susan's reporting and in the books that are coming out right now. There are so many details that we don't know about what happened. So many aspects of testimony that will be interesting to investigators for a variety of reasons that aren't coming up in law enforcement. So I think it's a critical question for McCarthy. And keep in mind, Liz Cheney's already on that panel. And I've been told she's looking at ways to make sure that her presence there is real, kind of supersize her presence on that committee, make sure that she, as a Republican, is asking real questions and not just playing defense for Donald Trump.
And Michelle, I want to turn to a few problems overseas, very close to us. However, you've got Haiti, you've got Cuba. What's going to happen there, and what are the concerns?
Well, I mean, the concerns are, first of all, refugees. I mean, from the American standpoint, the concern is, of course, refugees. The concern is you have expatriate communities who are pressing the administration for action in ways that people in those places don't necessarily want. I mean, you've got a kind of pressure from expatriates in Florida, for example, who are making noises about a military intervention. I have not heard one person in Cuba say that that's a good idea. So you've got those, and then you've got this kind of this overall context of people reacting to these grifter autocrats, which is something that we have seen kind of all over the world. I mean, all over the world, we've seen people sort of aggregating power to themselves for the sake of advantaging themselves and sort of the little cadre among them, the rest of the country being left behind. And it's powder kegs all over the world. I mean, Haiti and Cuba, there's also South Africa. And frankly, let's just say there's parts of the country in the United States where we're seeing the same thing. We're seeing sort of unrest in the streets. We're seeing a level of sort of violence that we haven't seen in years because people feel, and they're not stupid, they know they've been left behind. It's just one of those things where I think it's the next couple of years, it's just going to be kind of one series of restiveness after another. And it's a stress test for all democracies, frankly.
It is indeed, and we will leave it on that. That is a very complicated problem, as all foreign policy problems are. Thanks very much to all of you for coming in this morning.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.